earlier on today, she talked about the fact that this is obviously a very difficult day for workers in Canada's auto industry, in particular for people who had jobs at that facility. Here is a little bit more about what she said earlier on today.
But at the same time, we are creating a response group to make sure that we're bringing a new model, because 1,200 workers at the Ingersoll plant need to know that we're fighting for their job.
I think that Canadians see through all this. They want us to fight against the American tariffs as we're in this trade war. And so that's what I'm trying to do every single day.
In one sudden move, Canada's auto industry felt the ground shift. A major General Motors electric vehicle plant in Ontario shut down, leaving workers stunned. What looked like a routine business decision quickly turned into something far bigger. Trade pressure, rising tariffs, and political tension were already in motion, and this shutdown became the moment everything changed. The Canadian government moved quickly to frame the plant closure within the broader tariff dispute. Officials stated that U.S. trade measures had distorted investment decisions across the continent. In public remarks, Foreign Affairs Minister Joly said, "They want us to fight against the American tariffs as we're in this trade war, and so that's what I'm trying to do every single day." The statement reflected Ottawa's position that Canada was responding to pressure rather than initiating escalation. The federal government confirmed the creation of a response group aimed at securing a new production model for the Ingersoll facility. General Motors had positioned the shutdown as part of a restructuring of its electric vehicle strategy. However, Canadian officials emphasized that tariff-related cost pressures played a role in reshaping North American manufacturing economics. The auto sector in Canada employs hundreds of thousands of workers directly and indirectly, and government data shows that Ontario remains the country's manufacturing core. The loss of an EV facility carried symbolic weight, given federal commitments to transition the auto industry toward electric production. Canada's response centered on trade leverage already embedded in North American frameworks. Countermeasures were designed to offset the financial advantage U.S. companies gained from tariffs imposed south of the border. Federal statements confirmed that retaliatory tariffs were structured to target politically and economically sensitive sectors, while remaining compliant with existing trade agreements. The objective was to rebalance cost pressures rather than trigger uncontrolled escalation. The impact on General Motors was immediate. What had been expected to remain a contained plant closure became a continental issue affecting corporate planning. Executives were forced to reassess supply chains that depend on seamless cross-border movement of vehicles and components. Canada's message was explicit. Companies benefiting from integrated North American production could not isolate themselves from policy consequences affecting Canadian workers. The political dimension of the response was equally visible. Canadian officials rejected the assumption that job losses would be absorbed quietly. In one public briefing, it was stated that the affected workers need to know that we're fighting for their jobs. This framing linked trade policy directly to employment outcomes, rather than abstract trade balances. The government presented tariffs as industrial tools, not symbolic gestures. U.S. trade policy had already altered investment patterns across the auto industry. Section 232 tariffs and related measures raised costs for manufacturers operating on both sides of the border. Canada's retaliation highlighted how deeply interconnected the industry remains. Vehicles assembled in Canada often contain a majority of U.S.-sourced components, while American plants rely on Canadian parts and sub-assemblies. Disruptions in one jurisdiction reverberate quickly across the system. The episode also revealed limits to unilateral trade pressure. Canada's economy is smaller than that of the United States, but its leverage within the auto sector is structural. Production networks are designed around proximity, logistics efficiency, and regulatory alignment. Shifting capacity is expensive and slow. By targeting these realities, Canada forced corporations to factor political risk into decisions previously treated as purely financial. Federal officials framed the move as a defense of sovereignty rather than confrontation. Statements emphasized that Canada was acting within its rights under existing agreements. The tariffs were presented as proportional and strategic. The message was that industrial decisions affecting Canadian workers would carry consequences, even for the largest multinational firms. The broader implications extended beyond General Motors. Other automakers operating in North America were already monitoring the dispute closely. Investment plans for electric vehicles depend heavily on government incentives, regulatory certainty, and stable trade conditions. The Canadian government's actions signaled that it was willing to intervene when trade policies undermined domestic employment objectives. The dispute unfolded against a backdrop of political sensitivity in both countries. In the United States, trade policy had become a central economic tool, often framed as protecting domestic industry. Canada's response challenged that narrative by showing how tariffs could backfire within integrated markets. Canadian officials argued that American measures imposed costs on allies rather than isolating competitors. The Ingersoll plant became a focal point for this argument. Federal data confirmed that hundreds of jobs were directly affected, with broader ripple effects across suppliers and service providers. The government's response group was tasked with negotiating pathways to restore production, signaling that the closure was not accepted as final. Throughout the episode, Canada's approach remained rooted in existing trade law rather than ad hoc measures. This distinction was emphasized in official communications. The strategy relied on predictability and enforceability, not rhetoric. By doing so, Canada positioned itself as an active participant shaping outcomes, not a passive recipient of decisions made elsewhere. The clash underscored a shift in how trade disputes are managed within North America. Economic integration no longer insulated companies from political intervention. Instead, it amplified the impact of policy choices. Canada's use of tariffs demonstrated that leverage does not depend solely on market size, but on strategic position within supply chains.
In short, we don't know too much. The timeline suggests that President Trump announced this new blockade on sanctioned oil vessels late last week. After that, we have seen a ramping up of interdicting of these vessels done by the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. military. You mentioned on Saturday there was a second ship that was seized by the U.S. military and the U.S. Coast Guard that they say was operating against this blockade and transporting sanctioned Venezuelan oil. It appears there was a second ship on Saturday that they also tried to seize, that they were unable to do so.
In the past several days, renewed attention has focused on U.S. oil sanctions policy after former U.S. President Donald Trump publicly defended strict measures targeting Venezuelan crude exports. The comments arrive as global oil markets remain sensitive to supply disruptions and as U.S.-Venezuela energy relations continue to shift. The policy framework being discussed traces back to actions taken between 2017 and 2020, when Washington imposed sweeping restrictions on Venezuela's oil sector. The United States first introduced broad financial sanctions on Venezuela in August 2017, followed by direct sanctions on its state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., in January 2019. These measures prohibited U.S. companies from importing Venezuelan crude and barred most transactions involving PDVSA. At the time, the U.S. Treasury stated that the goal was to deny revenue to the government led by Nicolas Maduro, which Washington no longer recognized as the country's legitimate authority. Before sanctions, Venezuela was producing more than 2 million barrels of oil per day. By 2020, output had fallen below 500,000 barrels per day, according to publicly available production data. Oil exports, which historically generated over 90% of Venezuela's export earnings, declined sharply. The loss of revenue restricted the government's access to foreign currency and limited its ability to maintain infrastructure, import goods, and service debt. Trump has stated that oil restrictions were central to his administration's pressure campaign. He said the policy aimed to cut off the regime's main source of cash. During his presidency, the United States also imposed secondary sanctions, warning foreign companies and shipping firms that they could face penalties for handling Venezuelan oil. This led several international buyers and insurers to withdraw from the market, further constraining exports. An oil blockade, in practical terms, refers to the enforcement of these sanctions through financial restrictions, shipping controls, and limits on insurance coverage. Tankers carrying Venezuelan crude faced difficulties securing insurance and payment processing. As a result, exports increasingly relied on intermediaries and alternative markets, often at discounted prices. China became Venezuela's largest oil destination, followed by limited shipments to other Asian countries. The sanctions also affected Venezuela's refining capacity. With limited access to spare parts, diluents, and technical support, refineries operated below capacity. Fuel shortages became widespread inside the country despite its large oil reserves, which are officially estimated to be the world's largest. Gasoline rationing was reported in multiple regions during 2019 and 2020. In October 2023, the U.S. government temporarily eased some oil sanctions, allowing certain exports under specific licenses following agreements between the Venezuelan government and opposition groups. These licenses permitted limited sales to international markets and helped raise production modestly. However, U.S. officials warned that the relief could be reversed if political commitments were not met. Trump's recent remarks suggest a return to stricter enforcement if he were to regain office. For Venezuela's economy, a renewed oil blockade would likely reduce export volumes and foreign currency inflows. According to international financial data, oil revenue remains the primary source of government income, despite diversification efforts. Any decline in exports would affect public spending and imports. Inflation, which reached extremely high levels during the peak of sanctions, has moderated in recent years but remains elevated compared to regional averages. The impact extends beyond Venezuela. Some Caribbean nations rely on Venezuelan crude or fuel under bilateral agreements. Reduced supply has previously forced these countries to seek alternative sources at higher prices. Global oil markets may also feel indirect effects, particularly if sanctions remove several 100,000 barrels per day from available supply during periods of tight production.